delighted to be joined this evening by Milena Kalinovska. Milena has a distinguished career as a curator and exhibitions director, first in London, then here in the States at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and most recently, the Hirshhorn in DC. Since then, Milena has served as Director of Modern and Contemporary Art Collection at National Gallery in Prague, and it's during her time there that she worked closely with Emily and best came to know her work. Milena, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a great pleasure to know Emilie Brzezinski. I met her for the first time in the 80s when a Czech artist, Magdalena Jetelová, came here, had a small exhibition at the Direction Space at the Museum of Modern Art. And then together with Emilia, they work alongside in the place where Emilia lives. It was fascinating to go to her studio, looking at the variety of works that were all linked in a particular way. They were all surrounded around the all centered around the notion of wood and nature. Her first interest really was in minimalism, I would say. Artists such as Donald Judd or Carl Andre. However, she was never interested in sort of work that would not be organic. So she took their aesthetics or sensibilities and moved it further into the work that became very organic. You can call it almost post-minimalist, like Eva Hesse, let's say, because she used also different materials or played with wood in a very particular way.
Yeah.
For example, when you look at her early work, such as Broken Blocks from mid-80s, you can see the interest in a repetition of a particular column. And this sort of repetition was very typical, one could say, among the minimalists. However, she used saw, she used axe, she used sort of raping into the wood, sometimes even burning the wood. And you can say this is a completely different direction. And it was particularly in the 80s when artists were again interested in figuration, that she has used that opportunity to become more and more creative.
Yeah. And one of the things I think is so interesting about her biography is that she studied art history, but as you've said before, she was self-taught as a maker, as a sculptor.
She really was a self-taught, but I think she was extremely well informed.
Right.
As to what was happening in the art world, what was happening particularly with sculptors. But that was the sort of background knowledge. She really centered around her own intuition. She had her favorites, for example, Polish artist Magdalena Abakamowicz, who also was interested in one way in the human form or human expression, in the other way in kind of almost like an abstract work. And this is something that we can find in combination in the work of Emilia. To begin with, we could see abstract works, a table, columns. And then this all develops into, as you know, big chunks of wooden columns that would be carved inside. And they were really almost like vessels for human expression or for picturing the human voice or human experience inside.
Yes.
So in a way, she was moving with her times, meaning in terms of what generally artists were interested in, but really following her own intuition and her own love of wood.
Yes, yes. And interesting too, folks will get a chance to see, have had a chance to see a little peek inside her studio. and to understand the environment that she was working in too, that she was surrounded by woods and trees every day in her home.
Well, her studio was very, very exciting because there was a huge opening in the studio to the nature. We have to, I cannot remember how high the ceilings were in her studio, but I imagine that there were maybe 4 meters, 5 meters high.
Yes, yes, very high.
And the gate or the door opening to nature almost covered half of the wall of the studio. So in a way, inside and outside was very much connected. And I think this was very, very important to her.
Yes.
She needed to be in nature. She needed to feel nature. It's also interesting to note that she never cut the wood, meaning a live wood. She would always collect dead wood. She had enormous respect for nature and its growth. So in a way, she was collected wood that was not growing any longer. And that is something important to remember. Her respect for nature as a living organism and her love of wood as something that was alive before. And we also know that wood in some way constantly works. So she really enjoyed that relationship with the material that was never completely defined or completely dead, let's say like concrete.
Yes, exactly. And so, you know, the trees had finished their growing, living tree existence, and then she continued the lifespan by finding them and transforming them into works. It's beautiful.
I would also like to point out that she was in many ways, a very serious artist. I have worked with many artists and I know about their dedication to their work. Emilia was very, very dedicated. This was a person, if you would meet anywhere, she would really question you seriously about some of her thinking. For example, she was interested in making bronze cast out of her wooden sculptures. And we have this kind of bronze cast actually at the Krieger Museum that was done during the time of the former director, Judy Greenberg.
Yes.
And she was interested to see whether the bronze could really capture the elements of wood, the little linings and all of the bits and pieces. So she was a person who was constantly concentrating on her work. And when you meet her, you know, she was always in jeans and the shirt, her hair was tied at the back.
Ready to go.
Ready to go. And when you saw this beautiful figure that she was with the big saws and machetes, you would sort of look at her and think, how is this possible? But really, this is what she was dedicated to. This is what she loved. And I think in many ways, that was really who she was.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that her children say about her, you know, having grown up in the orbit of all of this art making, is what an incredible work ethic she had. And that she would get up every day and work, and, you know, and very, very tiring physical work,
and you
the process.
And you can really see that in many, many artists, you know, they have an incredible dedication to their work. And this is what Emilia was like. When we were, for example, getting from her donation to the National Gallery in Prague, the Broken Blocks 2 and Broken Blocks 3, you know, all of the questions about the transportation heights, how they should be put together, how they should be installed, she totally concentrated on. And she was very totally reliable, very practical. But at the same time, when you talked about the work, she listened very carefully and she would react to you. If, for example, you would say, why is this work burned? You know, what was there were these vessels. Why is it burned? What have you tried to do? she would have a very specific answer that she was experimenting. Arte Povera Artists at the time, which is an Italian group, similarly experimented with burning. And obviously she knew, so she was trying her own way of doing it.
Yes, yes. Well, and another thing that I'm finding out more and more as I talk to more folks about her work is how much she conferred with other artists and curators and invited them to her studio. I was just talking to Yuriko Yamaguchi the other day, and she said, "Oh yes, I used to go regularly to Emilie's studio. We had wonderful conversations, and
yeah,
you know,
Emilia was very interested in other artists' opinions. Actually, when Magdalena Jetelová came to her studio, it was on the invitation of Emilia. And I remember coming and looking at the works that they were doing separately. And there were other artists around who were sort of joining in this kind of exercise. And Emilia would come to the Hirschhorn Museum National Gallery, not only to look at art, but also to lectures, the lectures that to her were relevant. She was very intellectual also.
yes.
She was very well read. She was very inquisitive. And I think she particularly was interested in her own roots. As you know, she came from a very prominent Czech family, and her husband similarly from a very prominent Polish family. So she was naturally interested in the cultures of these two countries, and not only in the cultures generally speaking, but in the artists, what they were doing. And she traveled to these countries. There is a work by her at the Museum Kampa in the middle of Prague, which was created by a major collector, Mrs. Mladek, who had one of the largest private collection of Franz Kupka. And Emilia has a work there just outside of the museum on the river Vltava. Similarly, she had an exhibition in Gdansk in Poland. So she really was looking at the world internationally. You know, she wanted very much to know and be part of it, and be seen as an artist who is interested in her work to be seen everywhere, but also she was interested in seeing and understanding the artists in these countries. So I saw her as a very dynamic figure.
And when you look at the list of all the places she showed internationally, it's kind of incredible. And particularly when you consider what a job it was to move these pieces.
I totally
Not easy to ship.
I totally agree. Moving these sculptures is very, very demanding. And Emilia was always part of it. It's not that she created something and then she stood aside. No, she was very much part of the whole transportation, the entire installation. She was the person who would, you know, kneel down, move her work, look at it. And when I worked with her on her exhibition in 1914 at the Krieger Museum, she was very much involved. And she liked the kind of dialogue that an artist and curators have together, which is a sign of many important and very involved artists.
Yes, it's a real fertility of thought. Yeah. That's wonderful. You mentioned talking about how her interest in having the work cast in bronze, and I know she had several pieces, at least, that were cast in bronze. To your knowledge, did she feel that was, did the bronze casting live up to her hopes in terms of being able to capture the wood?
Yes, she wrote to me how thrilled she was with the pieces that were prepared by this particular casting company and were placed at the Krieger Museum. She was really thrilled how they managed to capture the quality of wood in the bronze but also how patina worked very well. And
Yeah.
Emilia did really talk to different curators in this area and possibly elsewhere to really understand what's important about the casting, how should it reflect the work. And she was planning to do more of these bronze castings because, as we know, when you have wood outside, it will deteriorate.
Yes.
And Emilia was fine with that. As many artists who work with wood, they understand that the sculpture will eventually become part of nature and that certain elements will deteriorate. But she was also thinking how else to approach the
Yes.
sculpture that she makes in wood and whether the bronze would work. And I know from her correspondence and talking to her that the bronze pieces that are at the Krieger were extremely satisfactory to her.
Yeah, that's good to know. I've been curious as to whether or not the concept of impermanence was particularly important to her, or whether it was just something to accept and, you know, cast them in bronze when possible.
I think like many artists who work with wood and have the work outside, they do accept the impermanence, similar to artists who work with paper.
Yes, right.
They know that the work will eventually have or attain different form. So I think for her, it was part of the work. But I think the idea of bronze presented another possibility. For example, Magdalena Abakamowicz, the major Polish artist that she admired, did also work with resin, wood, different sort of natural materials. And eventually, she also started to cast in bronze. And
she did,
maybe, yeah. I don't know for sure, maybe that was one of the things that Emilia saw and noticed that other artists, for example, even Schnabel, for example, create work in one material and then they have it done again in bronze. So I think that Emilia did see all of this and she was very careful in considering this. This is not that she would consider this at the beginning of her career. Really, it came more towards the end when she started to think about these possibilities.
Yes, and also, you know, kind of her work living on in certain places that it would require lasting a little bit longer.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is because the wood that she used was found, she used a lot of different kinds of wood, whereas some wood sculptors will work in cedar because it lasts longer. She worked in, you know, red oak and poplar and white oak and birch and everything, depending on what pieces she found.
You are absolutely right. She was looking at the wood because it was possible to get. And also she really liked the variety and the difference in qualities. I think she enjoyed that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned her her body of work, and of course, you know, when an artist, you know, kind of creates a lifetime of work, particularly a lifetime of work of very large pieces. You know, it's an interesting challenge to figure out, you know, how to get it out there, where to place it, how it's going to live on. And in relation to that, this gift to MPA is very exciting because I think that it will afford her an opportunity, even though she did exhibit a lot early in her career, but to also get this work that is still in her studio out into the world. And I wonder if you can just speak to the significance of the idea of those sculptures getting out and getting out there and folks having a chance to see them.
I think it's very exciting for you to receive a very large donation. I think it's a great opportunity to exhibit her work. And sometimes I wouldn't be even afraid to exhibit it outside or even put several pieces together. You can really create a very interesting dynamics between the pieces that are more like trunks and large, and maybe a smaller pieces that might have certain kind of qualities similar to the large piece.
Yes.
Show the kind of variety of works that she has made.
Yeah, well, and that leads me to another thing that I've been thinking about, and that is, as we look at the works that are in the studio, they're obviously, she worked often in multiples. So, you know,
Yes.
there were some works where she had as many as 16 pieces.
That's right.
That would go together. And I'm wondering, how much did she sort of change those groupings depending on the location and the site?
Yes, she would change. For example, when we were working at the Krieger, we were particularly looking at her bowls. Some of them were small, some of them were large, some of them were really huge. And as she placed them for me in the studio, we selected those that we felt shown best in the galleries and in relationship to each other. So she was never, I don't think, ever said that certain things should be placed together and never otherwise. Yes, they were placed together when it was a title for one work, like the broken columns and so on. So of course, these were placed together in a particular way. But if they were part of the series, it was never an idea that if she created 16 works, that they have to be shown together.
Yes.
It could be always.
Yeah, so she was flexible and
she was definitely
sort of site specifically.
Wonderful to show several of them together because it brings to mind the idea that she was interested in this seriality, which many artists at the time were interested in.
Yeah.
Minimalist artists, post-minimalist artists. And so it particularly points out at her similar kind of thinking as them.
Yeah, that's an incredibly insightful point. I'm excited by kind of looking at the work anew with that in mind too. Yeah. It's just been wonderful talking to you. And I just want to thank you for coming and agreeing to give us a little bit deeper insight into her process and her connection to the art world at large. And I hope you can come. I'd love to get you over to see the studio and
of course
kind of revisit some of those works. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on getting the collection. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for you, but it may also serve as an inspiration for other artists who may think of placing their work in your place.
Yes, a wonderful thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.